Welcome to the wonderful fantasy world. Subscribe now. The Mark of the Two Snakes, The Rebirth of the God Slayer, Volume 1, The Awakening of the Blood Oath, Chapter 3, The Choice in the Misty Wasteland. The rust-colored moonlight climbed onto the gear winch in the gallows square, casting the shadow of the giant gear onto the flagstone path, like an inverted mechanical giant hand. Aiden moved along the base of the wall. The snake-shaped wrench left by his father in his sleeve dug into his palm, painfully. The double snake pattern on the inner side of the wrench was slightly heating up, along with the sound of gears turning in the distance. This was the only keepsake his mother had stuffed into his swaddling clothes before her death. At this moment, it resonated with the double snake mark that had just appeared on his wrist. The winch gear in the center of the square was a full 5 meters in diameter. The serrated edges were engraved with church prayers, but in Aiden's blood-red eyes, they manifested as the sacrificial symbols of the previous Divine Throne experiment. The alien youth was hanging upside, down under the gear, and the snake-shaped birthmark on his back glowed faintly in the moonlight. It was the totem mark of the snake tribe in Chapter 4 of the prequel. Aiden had seen the same pattern in his father's blacksmith's shop log. The church bishop stood at the top of the winch, and the turning sound of the gears in his mechanical eye formed an eerie harmony with the clicking of the winch. In the name of the Holy Radiance, purify the spiritual vein thieves. The bishop's voice spread throughout the square through the gear amplifier. The double snake tattoo on his palm appeared and disappeared as the gears turned. The metal pattern was exactly the same as the Eternal Silence 17 Aiden had seen on the inner side of the inspection team leader's armor. Aiden noticed that there was a small pattern of 2 snakes entwining on the bearing of the winch. It was the mark in the corner of Loren's design drawing in Chapter 3 of the prequel, and now the church was using it as a sacred symbol. The youth's groan interrupted Aiden's recollection. He saw that there were already 4 cracks on the gear gauntlet above the youth's head. The omen of the inspection team leader's death was clearly visible in Aiden's blood-red eyes. The fragments of the bursting gear would pierce through the youth's heart in 17 seconds. Aiden reached for his belt, where there was a gear lock pick that old Tom had stuffed to him before his death. Under the rust on the surface, the snake tribe runes were faintly visible, identical to the mark left by Vera before she was petrified in Chapter 9 of the prequel. Apprentice, what are you standing there for? A He came from a church soldier behind him. Aiden looked down and saw that half of a gear pattern was exposed from the cuff of his disguised apprentice robe. It was a characteristic of human mechanical transformation in the previous Divine Throne experiment, exactly the same as Loren's mechanical prosthesis in Chapter 5 of the prequel. Instinctively, he reached for the double snake jade pendant around his neck, only to find that the bishop's gaze was fixed on his clenched hand. The winch started to turn, and the youth's body was slowly lifted. The sound of gears rubbing was mixed with the shrill scream of spiritual veins being extracted. Aiden's blood-red eyes suddenly caught the engravings inside the gear. WL-5, the code name for the 5th experiment of Vera and Loren, and also a failed product of the first attempt to fuse the blood of the 2 snakes during the Bloodfire Siege in Chapter 4 of the prequel. When the probe was about to pierce the youth's nape, he tore off his hood, and the red snake's spiritual light spread over the gear winch like rust. Godseal. The bishop's mechanical throat issued an alarm, and his mechanical eye suddenly glowed red. Aiden's wrench smashed onto the gear shaft. The blood-colored spiritual light shattered not only the winch, but also the church prayers on the gear surface, revealing the dense names of aliens on the inner layer. Sarah, Keith, Leah, these were the snake tribe elders erased by the church in Chapter 4 of the prequel. In the moment when the fragments splashed, he saw the name Eileen engraved on one of the gear pieces. It was the experimental subject number recorded in the log stolen by his parents in Chapter 11 of the prequel. You use the spiritual veins of aliens to drive the gears, yet you call them thieves? Aiden's angry roar echoed amidst the sound of the collapsing gears. The red snake's spiritual light condensed into the virtual shadow of a snake-headed sword in his palm. a scene resonating with the broken piece of Vera's snake-headed sword in Chapter 5 of the prequel. The bishop's mechanical wrist suddenly transformed into a gear chain, a weapon implanted when Loren signed a contract with the church in Chapter 10 of the prequel. The blood-colored pattern on the chain link was exactly the chain pattern that imprisoned Vera's spiritual veins. The battle unfolded among the gear fragments. Aiden found that the bishop's attack trajectory was completely consistent with the Godslayer spear technique in the log of the previous Divine Throne experiment. Every strike was imitating Loren's gear sword technique. When the chain wrapped around his arm, the battle afterimage from Chapter 8 of the prequel suddenly emerged on the metal surface. Vera's red snake sword collided with Loren's gear sword at the core of the Divine Throne, and the residual energy engraved the mark of the two snakes in the sky. Your mother's death was her own doing, the bishop suddenly spoke, and Loren's sneer was mixed in his mechanical voice. Vera needed the church's fire to awaken the mark of the two snakes on you. These words hit Aiden's temple like a sledgehammer. He remembered the dying projection of his father's war puppet, and the strange smile on his mother's face when she was being burned. The scene in Chapter 12 of the prequel, where his mother actively exposed her spiritual vein affinity ability during the heart-burning choice. The gears of the winch were still turning, and the youth's body was hanging in the air. The cracks in the gauntlet were approaching collapse. Aiden's blood-red eyes simultaneously caught two trajectories. To the left was the perfect route to kill the bishop, and to the right was a 3-second window to stabilize the youth's gauntlet with spiritual light. He suddenly remembered the whisper of the remnant soul in the jade pendant. Choose to save or to revenge. The red snake spiritual light suddenly turned towards the youth and condensed into a blood-colored shield before the gear gauntlet collapsed. You go against the divine oracle. The gears in the bishop's mechanical eye turned 疯狂的, revealing the mechanical core inside. The remains of Loren's mechanical heart eroded by spiritual veins in Chapter 5 of the prequel. Taking the opportunity, Aiden inserted the lockpick into the core of the winch. The snake-shaped pattern fit perfectly into the gear groove, which was the alien equipment technology his father had created in the Misty Wasteland in Chapter 13 of the prequel. The winch let out a dying roar, and the startup code of the previous Divine Throne experiment emerged on the gear surface, with a frequency completely consistent with the mark on his wrist. The moment the youth fell, Aiden caught him and found that half a piece of a red snake pottery cup fragment was hanging around his neck. It was a sacred object of the snake tribe spiritual vein ceremony in Chapter 2 of the prequel. The notch on the rim of the cup was exactly the same as the totem token of the Mara caravan. They have been looking for the jade pendant. The youth's fingers 划过 Aiden's chest mark, and his pupils suddenly contracted. There are two snakes fighting in your eyes, just like the Godseal in the legend. The sound of colliding gear armors came from all around the square. 12 holy radiance knights emerged from the shadows. The silver snake emblems in the center of their breastplates glowed coldly in the moonlight. Aiden's blood, red eyes swept over the spell, imprinted gear chains in their bodies. The chain-linked numbers were exactly the spiritual vein sequences devoured in the Eternal Silence disaster in Chapter 7 of the prequel. When the leading knight raised the resonance probe, Aiden finally saw the gear-shaped bones of his lower jaw, a characteristic of Loren's mechanical transformation in Chapter 5 of the prequel, proving that these church knights were no longer pure humans. Aiden blood's warm. Your mother's blood has given you Vera's spiritual vein resonance. The bishop's voice spilled out from the broken mechanical eye. But the remaining pages of the log your father hid didn't tell you the real curse of the mark of the two snakes, did they? The wreckage of the gear winch suddenly resonated, and the jade pendant in Aiden's hand showed the scene from Chapter 9 of the prequel. Vera handed the jade pendant to his grandfather, and a blood-colored leaf fell on the gear, forming a pattern identical to his mark. I don't need the church to defy my curse. Aiden tore up the church's offer of amnesty. The double snake gear emblem on the flyer distorted into Loren's mechanical gear and Vera's red snake form in the spiritual light. He picked up the youth and rushed towards the misty wasteland. Behind him came the bishop's angry roar. Do Do you think you can be safe by fleeing to the lair of the aliens? The ancient tree in the misty wasteland was formed from bearers' bones. These words made Aiden stop in his tracks. The description in his father's letter about the ancient tree hiding the legacy of the Godseal suddenly came to life in his mind. The scene in chapter 9 of the prequel where Vera's blood seeped into the ground when she was petrified, giving birth to blood-colored leaves, flashed through his mind. The youth's fingers dug into his shoulder and pointed to the distant horizon. Look! The church's gear fleet is blocking the entrance to the wasteland. Under the starry sky, the outlines of 12 gear-shaped warships slowly rose. The silver snake muzzles at the bow of the ships were exactly the same as the spiritual vein siphon cannons in chapter 4 of the prequel. Aiden reached for the jade pendant at his waist, and the voice of the remnant soul clearly sounded for the first time. To the left is the human city-state, and to the right is the misty wasteland. The former has the church's trap, and the latter has an unknown symbiosis ceremony. He stared at the snake-shaped birthmark on the youth's back and thought of Sarah 001 on the inner side of the inspection team leader's armor, the name of the youth's mother, one of the first victims of the previous Divine Throne experiment. In his blood-red eyes, two tracks of fate emerged among the gear warships. One was to surrender to the church and become the vessel of the Divine Throne. The other was to step into the misty wasteland and hear his mother's heartbeat in the songs of the aliens. I choose a third way. Aiden suddenly turned around. The red snake's spiritual light condensed into an arrow in his palm, pointing to the secret passage exposed in the ruins of the witch. It was the escape route in Loren's design drawing in chapter 3 of the prequel. The double snake relief at the entrance was absorbing his blood. The youth's pottery cup fragment suddenly became hot and resonated with the jade pendant, producing Vera's prayer from the previous Divine Throne experiment. Gears and blood are originally symbiotic rivers. When the first gear cannon shell bombarded the square, Aiden dragged the youth and jumped into the secret passage. The snake tribe runes on the stone wall lit up in the spiritual light. When the two snakes become one, the gears stop turning. This was the prophecy in his parents' notes in chapter 11 of the prequel. At this moment, it flowed on the mark on his wrist. The rumbling of mechanical operation came from the depths of the secret passage, resonating with his heartbeat. It was the sound of the gears his father had watched for 10 years on the edge of the misty wasteland, and also the pulsation of the double snake jade pendant his mother had stuffed into his palm before her death. The ground trembled under the shelling. Aiden reached for his pocket watch. The hands were pointing to the petrified ancient tree in the depths of the misty wasteland for no apparent reason. The youth suddenly pointed at his wrist and exclaimed, "Your mark is glowing. It's exactly the same as the key to opening the ancient tree's secret chamber in our tribe's legend." Aiden then noticed that the double snake mark was extending along the gear patterns on the stone wall of the secret passage. Each engraving corresponded to the name of an alien in the previous Divine Throne experiment. In the moonlight at the exit, the outline of the misty wasteland loomed. The poisonous fog churned like boiling gear lubricant. Aiden tore open the church apprentice robe, revealing the words, "Blood and gears are indispensable," engraved on the wrench by his father on the inner side. For the first time tonight, these words had weight. Not the church's lies, nor the aliens' legends, but his independent choice as the blood of the two snakes. Behind him came the bishop's near. "Do you think you can escape? The core of the Divine Throne has already planted gears in your blood." But Aiden didn't look back. He saw that under the blood-colored moon at the end of the wasteland, the silhouette of the petrified ancient tree was taking on the form of two snakes entwining. It was the prophecy of the unification of the two snakes in chapter 15 of the prequel, and also the first link in the truth about his mother's death, his father's disappearance, and the mark of the two snakes that he was about to uncover. The gears of the winch were still turning, but no one was controlling them anymore. Aiden pushed the youth in the direction where the caravan might appear, and then he reached for the core of the gear war puppet left by his father in the hidden compartment. The last gift his father had prepared for him in the solitary shadow in the misty wasteland in chapter 13 of the prequel. The gears in the core of the war puppet suddenly turned, projecting his father's smiling face. Aiden, when you learn to see the spiritual veins in the cracks of the gears, you will understand that what we forge is not a weapon, but the freedom of choice. These words dissipated in the sound of gunfire. Aiden clenched the wrench, letting the double snake mark burn on his arm. He knew that the church's gear fleet was approaching. The aliens in the misty wasteland might regard him as an enemy, and the remnant soul in the jade pendant was still silent. But at this moment, in his blood-red eyes, there was only the path ahead. A path paved with gear fragments and blood-colored spiritual veins. A path that even the god slayer of the two snakes in the prequel had never walked. Not to become a prisoner of the gears, nor a savior of the spiritual veins, but as Aiden Bloodsworn, to turn the gears of fate with his own hands. Outside the secret passage, the church soldiers found the torn offer of amnesty. The bloodstains of the mark of the two snakes meandered into a new pattern on the flagstone. Aiden's footprints, mixed with the blood of the alien youth, pointed to the depths of the misty wasteland. There, the petrified ancient tree was trembling slightly in the wind, and the blood-colored leaves fell like the rhythm of turning gears, waiting for the first person who refused to be defined to knock on the double doors of symbiosis and destruction. This episode ends here. The next episode will be more exciting. Subscribe now.